society, and the state. We've already talked about the political institutions in Russia. Now it's time to talk more about the people. Now, of course, when we talk about the people, we should talk about the social cleavages that kind of separate the people of Russia. And probably the biggest cleavage has always been nationality. In the USSR, under the Soviet Union, only about 50% of the population was ethnically Russian. So things have changed drastically when we're seeing um, the Russian population becoming a huge chunk of the populace. Now, most of the ethnic minorities from the Soviet Union are in those states like Poland and Ukraine, control. And this has led to conflict. Conflict where um, some minorities have tried to fight back against the government. Some minorities have felt persecuted by the government. We've seen terrorism with a lot of backlash towards minorities, blaming minorities. There were protests like Russia for Russians, in which they wanted to just have Russia with just the Russian nationality. So certainly the nationality, the ethnicity, becomes something that creates a conflict in this country. Now, most famous conflict of this occurs in Chechnya. In Chechnya, it's an exception to most of the other ethnicities in Russia. Most of those small ethnic groups in Russia would like to have independence, but most of them have too many trade benefits with Russia. They benefit greatly by being part of Russia. Chechnya is very different. It doesn't necessarily need Russia for a lot of its benefits. Uh, Chechnya has had open revolts. It has military revolts in the past. It's a primarily Muslim region. It has oil fields, so it already has wealth. It certainly could unite with neighboring countries like Georgia, and they have repeatedly fought for independence, including an increase in terrorism, terrorist attacks towards the Russian populace, even taking over a Russian school in 2004, a southern Russian school where 350 people were killed. So Chechnya has tried over and over again to try and gain some sort of independence, but essentially not doing necessarily very well at getting free. Russia has routinely tried to crush them essentially, and it also led them to get more involved with parts of Georgia, so like South Ossetia and Abkhazia, where Russia had to get militarily involved to return some order because they were causing conflict across the border in Russia. And of course, we could talk about Crimea and how they were annexed or invaded, depending on how you look at it. Here's a great map that kind of shows you the diversity of Russia. Being so large, it does have a lot of different minority groups, but there isn't a large populace of minority groups. So certainly there are other people in Russia, just not necessarily in large numbers or in kind of the cities of power in Russia. Now, religion, of course, most of you know that Russia has a history of Russian Orthodox Church. In fact, the Tsar was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, after the fall of the Tsar and the rise of the Soviet Union, basically religion was restricted. You were encouraged not to be a part of religion. Religious institutions were destroyed and discouraged, and you could be kind of sent away or purged if you were overly promoting religion. So there is a huge populace in Russia that is non-religious. But you'd probably say that Russia overall is Russian Orthodox. A lot of their leaders are, and Putin certainly promotes that as well inside Russia. You see other religions certainly in existence in Russia, and we've seen kind of increases in ethnic groups kind of getting more diverse, and especially in the Muslim population, many of them moving into Russia to work. Many people moving out of the Caucasus, so moving from potentially Georgia or Turkey or Azerbaijan, trying to get some sort of job, trying to find some place where they can call it home. Now, as far as social class under the Soviet Union, the divide amongst the populace was Communist Party member versus non-member. But today, it's really about the rich versus the working class. There's not a whole lot of in between. You either are kind of an ancestor of the oligarchs, so you could be wealthier, business owner, and the working class is generally struggling, trying to gain some sort of growth in that area. Interestingly enough, about Russia, most of their populace lives in the cities, and most of them are in the West. So major cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow are gigantic, and the population is gigantic, and that also leads to more education in the area and more Western values because it's very much connected to Europe. Whereas Vladivostok on the eastern side will have a very, very different cultural outlook. Also, I mean, it's just interestingly enough to think about that we just in Sochi, Russia, in which it was basically in the middle of nowhere, and they had to send in tons of workers to essentially build a city um, on um, on the sea, so they could, you know, have their Olympics in a relatively successful climate. Now, a little bit about their culture. Because of their history of authoritarianism and totalitarianism and monarchy, they have tended to want more centralized leadership. That's more appealing to the Russian populace. They're not as used to a republic or democracy like the United States. They're more used to someone being in control, a charismatic leader or a small group of people having power. For politics, the Soviet Union has built up that mistrust. There were so many lies and so much propaganda spread that it's not easy to believe everything government has proclaimed. But they still expect government to provide things for them. They expect the state to be active in healthcare, to be active in providing services, to be active in making sure people are allowed to retire, and active in helping out the people. And a lot of this comes from the communist ideology, kind of passed down through the generations. We're not that far back, or not that far forward from communism. And definitely there is a desire for stability because Russia has had a lot of instability in the past couple years. Now, another thing about political culture, they have terms that they use in general culture. They have Slavophile, which is what we would see as like a nationalist figure, a patriot is a Slavophile. Slav, of course, comes from the ethnic group that a lot of people in Eastern Europe kind of fall into, and these are people that believe in, Russia's best interests. Russia should be strong. Russia should reject those Western values. It's always had different values from the West, and it should maintain those. And we see, a lot of people that consider themselves Slavophiles fighting against kind of a Western approach, where there are a lot of reformers in Russia that are wanting to integrate things, wanting more market, wanting more Western values, wanting to bring in more of a Western culture. So we're seeing kind of a tear in the populace amongst Slavophiles, so people that want Russian nationalism, and Westerners that want to be more connected to like Europe and the United States and other industrialized nations. Now, as far as political participation, it is a little bit down from the Soviet Union, where it was 100%. We're now talking about 70 to 65% on average. Now, this could be debated about whether or not this number is accurate. We'll talk about some errors in class and how maybe it's not 100% accurate, but that is a pretty good number for a democracy to be in the 70% range. Now, civil society is relatively new. Organizations weren't allowed to flourish under the Soviet Union, so now we're seeing a lot more organizations forming with different issues, media organizations, social clubs, all that stuff being created. But Vladimir Putin has made it rather difficult, making it difficult as far as what you have to report, what you have to register, and whether or not you need supervision by the government. So trying to restrict the ability of people to create their own organizations. Uh, for example, they can investigate your sources of income. They can send in police to witness your activities. In 2012, during Russia's re-election, they entered in new laws restricting nonprofits and foreign financing. So they're trying to fight back against that, outside influence and fight back against rebellion. Now, certainly, we've seen a lot of protests in recent years, a lot of groups trying to fight back. We'll talk about some of them in class, but essentially, there's a lot of restrictions on what you can do. You're allowed to picket protest as long as you're 50 meters different distance between each person picketing. So any mass protest is seen as forbidden. And we'll talk about, just the act of throwing a rock at a government building could result in, jail time. And there are very strict penalties for some people. So some folks have had large sentences for what would seem minor, political crimes in the United States, if crimes at all. There are very, very strict guidelines about what is allowed for protest. Oh, let me just chime in one thing about the other Russia. This is a basic group that is just in opposition of United Russia, and they have people from both the left and right ideology kind of fighting back against Vladimir Putin. But a lot of their members have been depleted because of arrests, people being arrested for protesting. Now, on the other hand, if you're doing patriotic political activity like rallying for Putin or rallying for United Russia, that's okay. So we've seen groups like Nashi, which is the largest youth group, which is all in support of patriotism and in support of Russia, in support of nationalism, and it's building up that national identity. And it's definitely in support of Putin. So we see this organization having a lot of influence and getting young people involved and interested in politics, and in more particular, United Russia. And by the way, they receive government funding to exist. So whereas one side, if you're protesting against the government or against Putin, you can be arrested and jailed for years. And on the other side, if you are doing pro-Putin or pro-United Russia stuff, you can get funding by the government. I think we're seeing a drastic difference in what is acceptable for culture in Russia. And it feels very similar to, an authoritarian regime. That is all for now. Thank you for tuning in.